Welcome to the deep dive. We have a pretty incredibly ambitious mission today.
We really do.
Yeah, we are taking an encyclopedic look at Spain. And I mean a truly massive, sweeping profile based on a whole range of historical, geographical, and modern economic sources.
Right. We're covering everything from its ancient roots to its current status as this massive cultural and economic superpower.
Exactly. The goal here is to give you, the listener, a shortcut to understanding how a nation with so many contradictory forces actually functions today, and, why its footprint on the modern world is so undeniable.
It is a monumental topic. I mean, we are pulling together thousands of years of human geography, political evolution, modern data. But the key is looking past the typical tourist brochures.
Yeah, getting into the mechanics.
Exactly. We want to understand the actual mechanics of the country. Why is it built the way it is? How do its regions interact? What makes its economy tick in the 21st century?
Right. But before we even get into the heavy political or economic mechanics, I want to start with something from your notes that completely caught me off guard.
Oh, the etymology.
Yes. Because when most people think of Spain, they think of this sprawling global empire, the conquistadors, or maybe Real Madrid and flamenco. But you pulled up the origin of the country's very name.
Yeah, it's a great detail.
The word Spain comes from the Roman name for the peninsula, Hispania. But where did the Romans actually get that?
They inherited it from the Phoenicians.
The seafaring traders.
All right, the ancient seafaring traders who established coastal settlements there roughly 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
The ancient Phoenician phrase was Aish Fanem.
And what does that literally translate to? Because I was shocked.
It translates to land of rabbits.
Land of rabbits.
Yeah, or more specifically, land of hyraxes, which was a small, furry mammal the Phoenicians were familiar with back in the eastern Mediterranean.
Okay, so they show up and just see rabbits everywhere.
Exactly.
Mm.
When they arrived on the Iberian Peninsula, they saw an overwhelming number of rabbits and essentially just named this massive, rugged landmass after them. In fact, Roman coins from Hadrian's reign even featured a female figure with a rabbit at her feet.
That is just wild to me. You have empires founded by wolves, like Rome, or symbolized by lions, like England. And Spain, this nation that would eventually conquer entire continents, starts out as the land of bunnies.
It's a great historical irony. But what's fascinating here is how a piece of land, named by ancient sailors after its local wildlife, became a geographic pivot point for the entire world.
Yeah, connecting the Mediterranean and the Atlantic.
Exactly. That ancient geography jutting out into both the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea is the absolute foundation of everything Spain is today. You cannot separate Spain's history or its current status as the fourth most populous member of the European Union from its geography.
Okay, let's unpack that geography, because looking at the maps and the topographical data, Spain seems like a land of absolute extremes. It's huge, the fourth largest country in Europe. But it's not just a European country, is it? It's actually transcontinental.
That's right. Mainland Spain dominates the Iberian Peninsula, which it shares with Portugal. But the Spanish state also includes the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean, the Canary Islands way out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa.
Way out there.
Yeah, and two autonomous cities, Ceuta and Melilla, which are physically located on the mainland of North Africa, bordering Morocco.
That North African border is fascinating. We constantly hear about the border between Europe and Africa as this vast maritime divide, the Mediterranean. But Spain literally shares a land border with an African nation.
Yes, and those borders are a direct legacy of centuries of Mediterranean geopolitics. But even if we just look at the mainland, the topography is incredibly imposing. Spain is the second most mountainous country in Europe.
Right after Switzerland, I think.
Right after Switzerland.
Yeah.
The center of the country is dominated by the Meseta Central, which is this massive, high-altitude plateau. And that plateau is ringed and crossed by huge mountain chains.
Like the Pyrenees in the north, creating that massive natural wall with France.
Precisely. You have the Pyrenees, the Cantabrian Mountains running along the northern coast, and the Beetic system down in the south. And speaking of mountains, here is a piece of trivia that always surprises people. The highest peak in Spain isn't in the Pyrenees.
Right, it's not even on the European continent.
It's not.
Wait, where is it again?
It's Mount Tide, which stands at 3,718 meters. It is an active volcano located on the island of Tenerife in the Canary Islands.
An active volcano.
Yeah. If you measure it from its base on the ocean floor, it is actually the third largest volcano in the world. So the highest point of this major European nation is an island volcano off the coast of Africa.
That perfectly illustrates how geographically scattered the country is. And speaking of scattered geography, I have to bring up this anomaly you highlighted in the source notes. Up in the Pyrenees, there is a tiny town called Livia. Can you explain what is going on there?
Ah, Livia. Livia is a Spanish exclave. It is
Yeah.
a small town of a few thousand people, legally part of the Spanish province of Girona, but it is physically located a few kilometers inside France,
So it is completely surrounded by French territory.
completely surrounded.
How does something like that even happen? Did they just accidentally draw the border wrong centuries ago?
It dates back to a treaty in 1659, the Treaty of the Pyrenees, where Spain ceded several villages in that region to France. But Livia held the legal status of a town or city, not a village.
Because of its Roman history, right?
Exactly, because it had been an ancient Roman capital in the area. So by a strict legal technicality, Spain got to keep it. It perfectly illustrates how deep-rooted and painstakingly negotiated European borders really are.
So you have this massive, mountainous, fragmented landmass. Let's talk about the climate, because when I picture Spain, I usually picture sun-baked beaches and arid plains. But the climate data paints a much more complicated picture. The system divides the country into three distinct zones.
That's right. If we use the standard Köppen climate classification, Spain is deeply divided. The most widespread is the Mediterranean climate.
Which is the classic idea of Spain.
Yeah, this is what you were just picturing. Warm to hot, very dry summers and mild winters. This covers the southern coast, the eastern coast, and much of the central plateau.
Okay, so that's zone one. What are the other two?
Zone 2 is the semi-arid climate, primarily found in the southeastern quarter, in regions like Murcia and Almeria. This area gets so little rainfall that it is essentially desert-like.
So literal deserts.
Yes, the Tabernas Desert in Almeria is one of the only true semi-deserts in Europe, which is why they film so many classic spaghetti westerns there. Looks just like Arizona or New Mexico.
And the third zone.
The third is the complete opposite. It's the oceanic climate in the north and northwest regions like Galicia, Asturias, Cantabria, and the Basque Country.
Facing the Atlantic.
Right. Because it faces the Atlantic Ocean, this region receives steady, heavy rainfall year-round. There is no real dry season. It is lush, emerald green, and often covered in mist. They call it green Spain.
So I want you, the listener, to just imagine taking a road trip across this country. You start your engine up in the Basque Country. It's pouring rain. The mountains are vibrant green. The air is damp and cool. You drive a few hours south, crossing the mountains onto the central plateau, and suddenly the green vanishes.
It's just gone.
Yeah, you are on this vast, elevated plain that is freezing in the winter and baking hot in the summer. Then you keep driving southeast, and by the afternoon, you are literally in a sun-baked desert canyon that looks like the American Wild West. It is like driving through three entirely different continents in a single day.
And that road trip analogy is crucial for understanding the Spanish psyche. For thousands of years, before modern highways or high-speed rail, those imposing mountain ranges and those harsh, contrasting climates created massive natural barriers.
It locked people in.
Exactly. Communities were isolated in their specific valleys or coastal strips. That geographic isolation is the engine that created the fiercely distinct regional identities, cultures, and languages that define Spain today. The geography bred the politics.
But geography isn't static. And I noticed a pretty alarming section in your notes regarding modern environmental challenges. With a climate already so prone to heat and aridity, what is climate change doing to Spain?
Spain is one of the countries in Europe most severely threatened by climate change. The data shows that average temperatures are rising faster there than the global average.
Which is terrifying.
It is. Extreme events like prolonged, brutal heat waves and severe droughts are becoming the new normal rather than the exception.
How does a country survive that if its entire economy relies on agriculture in the south and millions of tourists wanting nice weather on the coast? If you don't have water, you can't grow olives, and you can't fill hotel swimming pools?
It is an existential challenge.
Mhm.
Water scarcity in the southern basins is already a critical political issue. To adapt, Spain is having to rapidly rethink its entire infrastructure.
Like what kind of infrastructure?
They are investing heavily in desalination plants, completely overhauling agricultural water use, and aggressively pivoting their energy grid toward renewables like solar and wind to mitigate their carbon footprint. They're essentially racing against their own geography.
Let's transition from the geography to the people who have inhabited it. We need to look at this deep, deep history, what the sources call the crucible of cultures. Just how far back does human presence go on the Iberian Peninsula?
The timeline is staggering. Archaeological research, particularly at a famous site called Atapuerca in the north, shows that early hominids were present there roughly 1.3 million years ago.
Over a million years, that is almost impossible to conceptualize.
It is. And modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived around 35,000 years ago. These were the Cro-Magnon people, and they left behind some of the most spectacular prehistoric art in the world.
The cave paintings.
Yeah, the Altamira caves in Cantabria featured these incredibly vivid polychrome paintings of bison, horses, and deer that date back over 15,000 years. Picasso reportedly visited the caves and supposedly said, "After Altamira, all is decadence."
So it was a massive hub for early humanity. But let's fast forward to recorded history. You mentioned the Phoenicians naming the place, but who else was showing up on the coasts?
The Mediterranean coast was a magnet for the great seafaring powers of antiquity. You had the indigenous Iberians on the coast and the Celts in the interior. But then the Greeks established trading colonies.
Right.
Then came the Carthaginians from North Africa, who actually conquered a large portion of the peninsula under generals like Hamilcar Barca and Hannibal.
Right. Hannibal famously marched elephants from Spain across the Alps to attack Rome, which brings us to the Romans. The Romans eventually decide they want the peninsula for themselves. Was it an easy conquest?
Not at all. It took the Roman Republic nearly 200 years of grueling, brutal warfare against the local Celtic and Iberian tribes to fully pacify the region.
200 years just to conquer it.
Yeah, but once they secured it, they stayed for over 6 centuries. And that period of Romanization fundamentally rewired the DNA of the peninsula.
What does Romanization actually look like in practice? Are we just talking about military garrisons, or was it deeper?
It was total cultural and economic integration. Hispania wasn't just a rugged frontier outpost. It became a core economic engine for the entire Roman Empire.
Building roads and aqueducts.
Exactly. They built massive infrastructure aqueducts like the one in Segovia, which is still standing perfectly today, and an extensive network of Roman roads. Hispania exported immense quantities of gold, wool, and particularly olive oil and wine to feed Rome.
And the people themselves. Did they become Roman?
Completely. The local aristocratic classes assimilated deeply. In fact, some of the most influential figures in Roman history were born in Hispania.
Really? Like who?
Emperor Trajan, who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, was born there. Emperor Adrian, who built the wall in Britain, was Spanish. The great Stoic philosopher Seneca was from Córdoba. Today, Spain's legal system, its foundational religion of Christianity, and its languages, Spanish, Catalan, Galician, all stem directly from this deeply rooted Roman era.
But the Roman Empire eventually collapses. The western half falls in the 5th century. Who fills the power vacuum in Hispania?
Various Germanic tribes swept down from the north, the Suebi, the Vandals, and finally the Visigoths. The Visigoths eventually consolidated power and established a kingdom with its capital in Toledo.
Okay, so a Germanic kingdom.
Yeah, they ruled for a few centuries, but their state was often weakened by internal power struggles among the nobility.
And that internal weakness sets the stage for arguably the most dramatic pivot in Spanish history, the year 711. Can you explain what happened?
In 711, an army of the Umayyad Caliphate crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa into Spain. Taking advantage of the fractured Visigothic kingdom, they conquered nearly the entire peninsula in just 7 years.
7 years compared to the Romans' 200.
Exactly. This event completely severed Spain from the trajectory of the rest of Western Europe and birthed the era of Al-Andalus.
Explain Al-Andalus for me like I'm 5. We are talking about an Islamic civilization taking root in Western Europe. What was life actually like during this period?
For several centuries, particularly under the Caliphate of Córdoba in the 10th century, Al-Andalus was arguably the most advanced, prosperous, and cosmopolitan civilization in Europe.
While the rest of Europe was struggling.
Yeah, while much of Northern Europe was experiencing what we used to call the Dark Ages, Córdoba had paved streets, streetlights, hospitals, and massive libraries.
And what about the population? Did everyone just convert to Islam immediately?
It was a gradual process, but yes, a large portion of the local Hispano-Roman Visigothic population eventually converted to Islam. These local converts were known as mullahs, and by the 10th century, they formed the majority of the population.
But there were still Christians and Jews.
There were. Significant Christian and Jewish populations lived under Muslim rule as dhimmis, or protected minorities, subject to a special tax. It was a deeply complex polyglot society.
But the Islamic forces didn't conquer the absolute entirety of the peninsula, right?
Yeah.
They're holdouts.
Correct. Up in the extreme mountainous north places like Asturias, Leon, and the Basque region, small Christian kingdoms held out. And almost immediately, they began a slow, grinding, centuries-long southward expansion to reclaim the peninsula. This process is known as the Reconquista.
The Reconquista is fascinating because it lasts for nearly 800 years. It's not just one continuous holy war, it's a messy geopolitical struggle. Sometimes Christian kings allied with Muslim emirs against other
It
Christians.
was incredibly fluid.
Yeah. But beyond the warfare, there was incredible intellectual cross-pollination. I noticed you highlighted the capture of Toledo in 1085. Why was that specific city so important?
When the Christian forces took Toledo, it was a massive strategic victory. But more importantly, Toledo held vast libraries of Arabic scholarship.
Oh, the preserved knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the scholars in Al-Andalus had spent centuries preserving, translating, and expanding upon ancient Greek and Roman texts, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy knowledge that had largely been lost to Western Europe.
So what happens when the Christian kingdoms get their hands on these libraries?
They started a massive translation movement. Scholars from all over Europe traveled to Toledo. They would translate the Arabic texts into the local vernacular, Castilian, and then from Castilian into Latin.
Sparking a massive shift.
Yes, this passing of knowledge acted as a massive intellectual shockwave that helped spark the Renaissance in Christian Europe.
It is a staggering contrast. You have these brutal existential frontier wars raging for centuries, but you also have this profound intellectual synthesis happening simultaneously. And society was evolving politically, too. Look at this data point from the sources. The year 1188, the Cortes of Leon. What was that?
In 1188, King Alfonso X of Leon convened the Cortes, which is recognized by UNESCO as the first documented example of a modern parliamentary session in Europe.
So an actual parliament.
Yes, he brought together not just the nobility and the bishops, but elected representatives of the citizens from the major towns.
Wait, let me get this straight. Over a decade before the Magna Carta in England, while fighting a massive multi-generational war for control of the peninsula, they are inventing modern representative governance.
Exactly. That duality is a defining hallmark of Spanish history. The constant friction forced rapid social and political innovation. And that friction finally reached its climax in the year 1492.
1492. It is impossible to overstate how consequential that single year is, not just for Spain, but for human history. Walk us through the three massive events that occurred based on our sources.
First, the Reconquista officially ended. The Catholic monarchs, Queen Isabella VII of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, whose marriage had essentially united the two most powerful Christian kingdoms, conquered Granada, the very last Muslim-ruled state on the peninsula.
Okay, so the peninsula is unified under Christian rule. What's the second event?
Second, Christopher Columbus, funded by Queen Isabella, sailed west across the Atlantic and made landfall in the Americas, fundamentally altering global geography, economics, and human history.
And the third event, because this is where the history gets significantly darker.
The third event was the Alhambra Decree. As part of their drive to create a religiously unified state, Ferdinand and Isabella ordered the expulsion of all practicing Jews from Castile and Aragon.
An absolute tragedy.
Yes. The Jewish population was forced to choose between converting to Catholicism, leaving the country without their wealth, or facing execution. Up to 200,000 Jews were expelled.
And did a similar policy apply to the Muslim population after the fall of Granada?
It did, though it took slightly longer. Initially, the Treaty of Granada promised religious tolerance for Muslims. But within a decade, those promises were broken. Islam was outlawed in Castile in 1502 and Aragon in 1527.
So they forced conversions.
Yes. The remaining Muslim population was forced to nominally convert to Christianity. They became known as Moriscos. But they were deeply distrusted by the state, and decades later, in the early 1600s, over 300,000 Moriscos were systematically expelled from Spain, mostly deported to North Africa.
It's a profound contradiction. You have this moment of incredible national triumph and global expansion, built simultaneously on brutal religious purging and the erasure of minority communities that had been there for centuries.
It is a very complex legacy.
But looking at the geopolitical map, 1492 essentially catapults Spain into its golden age.
It does. Under the Habsburg dynasty in the 16th and 17th centuries, specifically under King Charles V and his son Philip II, Spain became the first true global superpower. The empire spanned the globe.
It was massive.
They conquered the Aztec and Inca empires in the Americas, established territories from California to Patagonia, controlled the Philippines and the Indo-Pacific, held outposts in Africa, and ruled significant chunks of Europe, including the Low Countries and much of Italy.
The wealth flowing back to the peninsula must have been unfathomable. galleons filled with silver from Potosi in South America. But looking at the historical analysis, here's where it gets really interesting. There is a massive economic paradox. If they had a monopoly on the wealth of the New World, why did the empire begin to decline so agonizingly slow?
The paradox is that the sheer volume of wealth actually destroyed the Spanish economy.
How is that possible?
First, the massive influx of silver caused rampant, crippling inflation across Europe. Second, instead of investing that wealth into domestic industry or infrastructure, the Spanish Habsburgs saw themselves as the ultimate defenders of Catholicism.
Right. This is the era of the Protestant Reformation.
Exactly. The Habsburgs enmeshed Spain in nearly continuous, ruinously expensive continent-wide wars. They were fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, intervening in the French Wars of Religion, fighting a grueling, decades-long war to crush the Dutch revolt, and heavily funding the Catholic side in the devastating 30 Years' War.
So they were essentially using Aztec gold and Incan silver to pay mercenaries to fight Protestants in Germany and the Netherlands.
Yes, the cost of maintaining global armies and massive navies, like the famous Spanish Armada that failed to invade England in 1588, eventually outpaced even the silver coming from the Americas.
They went bankrupt.
Repeatedly. The Spanish crown repeatedly declared bankruptcy. They taxed their own domestic agricultural and merchant classes into oblivion, hollowing out the economy from the inside.
It's a classic imperial trap. But while the state was fighting these endless wars, the intellectual life of the country was surprisingly progressive. I want to ask you about a group mentioned in the notes, the School of Salamanca. Who were they, and why do they matter today?
The School of Salamanca was a group of Spanish theologians, jurists, and philosophers in the 16th century, primarily centered around the University of Salamanca. As the realities of the conquest of the Americas began to reach Spain, these thinkers began to deeply debate the moral and legal implications of empire.
What were they actually debating? Were they arguing against the conquest?
They were asking foundational questions. Thinkers like Francisco de Vitoria asked, do the indigenous people of the Americas have souls? Yes. Do they have reason? Yes.
Wow.
Do they possess natural rights to their own land and property? Yes. Therefore, by what legal or moral right does the Spanish crown conquer them?
That is incredibly subversive for the 1500s.
It was. In trying to answer these questions, the scholars of Salamanca essentially laid the philosophical groundwork for modern international law and universal human rights. They argued that there are natural laws that apply to all humans, regardless of their religion or nation.
So while the Spanish state was executing a conquest, Spanish intellectuals were simultaneously inventing the very legal frameworks we use today to condemn such conquests.
Precisely.
That brings us to a major pivot point. The Habsburg dynasty eventually dies out at the end of the 17th century, leading to a massive war over who gets the throne, and eventually a French dynasty, the Bourbons, takes over. They try to centralize everything, modernize the state, strip away regional autonomy. But then we hit the 19th century. And the notes for the 19th century read like a complete nightmare.
The 19th century was utterly catastrophic for Spain. It began with betrayal. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte convinced the Spanish government to allow French troops into Spain to invade their mutual enemy, Portugal.
A Trojan horse maneuver.
Exactly. Once the French armies were inside Spain, they simply occupied the Spanish fortresses. Napoleon forced the Spanish king to abdicate and installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne.
And how did the Spanish people react to being tricked and occupied?
On May 2nd, 1808, the people of Madrid rose up in a massive, bloody rebellion against the French troops. This sparked the Peninsular War, which dragged on for years.
I've heard the term guerrilla warfare originates from this specific conflict. Is that true?
Yes. The conventional Spanish army was largely defeated or scattered. So the Spanish populace formed irregular bands of fighters that constantly harassed the French supply lines, ambushed patrols, and refused to fight pitched battles.
Guerrilla meaning little war.
Right. The word guerrilla literally means little war in Spanish. It was a brutal, relentless insurgency that bled Napoleon's armies dry. He later called it his Spanish ulcer.
But amidst all that chaos, with the king gone and the country occupied, the Spanish didn't just fight, they tried to build a new society. Tell me about what happened in the city of Cadiz in 1812.
Cadiz was one of the few Spanish cities not occupied by the French, protected by the British Navy. In 1812, an assembly of delegates from across Spain and its overseas colonies met there and drafted the Constitution of 1812. It was one of the most progressive documents of its era.
What made it so progressive?
It established a constitutional monarchy. It called for universal male suffrage, freedom of the press, land reform, and stripped the Inquisition of its power. It shifted sovereignty from the king directly to the nation. It was a deeply liberal, modernizing blueprint for the future.
But I'm guessing it didn't last?
No. After the British, Spanish, and Portuguese forces finally expelled the French in 1814, King Ferdinand VII returned to Spain. Instead of embracing the Constitution, he immediately abolished it, arrested the liberal delegates, and reestablished an absolute monarchy.
And the consequences of that absolute chaos at home must have completely fractured the empire abroad.
Exactly. While Spain was fighting Napoleon and dealing with absolute monarchs versus liberals at home, the vast overseas empire realized they didn't need the metropole. The local elites in the Americas, the criollos, began demanding sovereignty. This sparked the Spanish-American Wars of Independence.
And it all collapsed relatively quickly, didn't it?
By 1826, Spain had lost nearly its entire empire in the Americas, everything from Mexico down to Argentina. They only managed to hold on to Cuba and Puerto Rico. And the domestic situation didn't improve.
More civil wars.
Yes, the rest of the 19th century was consumed by the Carlist Wars, which were essentially vicious civil wars between ultra-traditionalists who wanted an absolute monarchy and liberals who wanted a constitutional system. The century then ended with the ultimate humiliation, the Spanish-American War in 1898.
Right, the conflict with the United States.
In a matter of months, the U.S. fleet decimated the Spanish Navy. Spain lost its final major overseas colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The generation of Spanish intellectuals living through 1898 viewed it as a profound national disaster. It triggered a massive identity crisis. What is Spain if it is no longer an empire?
So you enter the 20th century. The empire is completely gone. You have a deeply polarized society. The military feels humiliated. The working class in industrial hubs like Barcelona is embracing anarchism and socialism. The regions like Catalonia and the Basque Country are demanding autonomy again. It feels like a powder keg. How does it finally detonate?
The detonation process begins in 1931. The monarchy, heavily discredited by political corruption and disastrous colonial wars in Morocco, held municipal elections. The results in the major cities were overwhelmingly Republican. Realizing he had lost the support of the people, King Alfonso III fled the country. The Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed to massive popular celebration.
A republic without a shopping fire. That sounds incredibly hopeful.
It was a moment of immense optimism for modernizers. The new Republican government passed a highly progressive democratic constitution. They granted women the right to vote, instituted secular education, separated church and state, and attempted massive agrarian land reforms to break up the vast estates of the aristocracy.
But if they are stripping power from the church, the military, and the wealthy landowners, I imagine the backlash was severe.
The backlash was immediate and intense. The political spectrum radicalized at a terrifying pace. You had militant anarchists and communists on the far left, and fascists, monarchists, and conservative Catholics on the far right. The 1930s saw intense political violence, church burnings, strikes, and failed coups from both extremes. The center entirely collapsed.
And this leads us to 1936. What is the specific spark that ignites the Spanish Civil War?
In July 1936, following the election of a left-wing Popular Front government, a faction of conservative military officers staged a coordinated coup d'etat. However, the coup didn't fully succeed.
It split the country.
Yes. The military rebels took control of roughly half the country, but the Republican government, armed trade unions, and loyalist military units held the other half. The country fractured, and the Spanish Civil War began.
I always hear the Spanish Civil War described as a dress rehearsal for World War II. Can you explain the international proxy aspect of this conflict? Because it wasn't just Spaniards fighting Spaniards.
The international context is crucial. The rebel faction, known as the Nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco, immediately appealed to fascist powers for help. Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany and Benito Mussolini in fascist Italy sent massive military aid, including tanks, troops, and the infamous Condor Legion, which bombed the civilian town of Guernica.
And who supported the Republican government? Did the democracies like Britain, France, or the U.S. step in?
No. The Western democracies signed a strict non-intervention pact, terrified of sparking a wider European war. The only major power to support the Democratic Republic was the Soviet Union, which sent weapons and advisors, though they used their influence to purge non-communist leftist factions.
So it was really a proxy war.
Entirely. Mexico also sent aid, and thousands of international volunteers formed the international brigades to fight against fascism.
The numbers in our sources are just horrific. Over 500,000 people died in the span of 3 years. Another 500,000 citizens fled over the Pyrenees as refugees into France, many ending up in concentration camps. It was a total societal trauma.
It was devastating. The war ended on April 1st, 1939, with an absolute nationalist victory. General Francisco Franco established a rigid, right-wing dictatorship that would rule Spain for the next 36 years.
Describe Spain under Franco in those early years. What did that dictatorship actually look like for the average citizen?
Franco's regime was characterized by authoritarian control, political repression, and economic autarky, meaning they tried to be completely self-sufficient and closed off from the world.
And the culture.
They promoted national Catholicism, a strict fusion of the state and the ultra-conservative wing of the Catholic Church. They aggressively suppressed any regional identity. Speaking Catalan, Basque, or Galician in public was banned. The media was heavily censored. Hundreds of thousands of political opponents were imprisoned or executed in the years following the war.
So the country is completely isolated, economically ruined from the war, and closed off. But I've read about this period in the 1960s called the Spanish Miracle, where the economy suddenly exploded. How does a closed dictatorship pull off an economic boom? It seems totally contradictory.
The shift was driven by the geopolitics of the Cold War. By the 1950s, the United States was deeply concerned about Soviet expansion. Spain's geographic location at the entrance to the Mediterranean was incredibly strategic.
Ah, so they made a deal.
They did. Despite Franco being a fascist-aligned dictator, the U.S. signed the Pact of Madrid in 1953, providing massive financial aid in exchange for the right to build American military bases in Spain.
So American money ends the isolation.
Yes. And realizing the autarky policy was failing, Franco appointed a new cabinet of technocrats, mostly economists and engineers, who implemented sweeping stabilization plans. They opened the economy to foreign investment, integrated Spain into global trade systems, and actively promoted mass tourism.
And people moved to the cities.
Millions of rural Spaniards migrated to urban centers like Madrid and Barcelona to work in new factories. The economy grew at a rate second only to Japan during the 1960s.
But despite the economic boom, the political system is still a dictatorship. Franco rules until his death in November 1975. Now, we often see dictatorships violently collapse or plunge into civil war when the strongman dies. How did Spain navigate this? Because what happens next is universally cited as one of the most successful political transitions in history.
Before his death, Franco had designated Juan Carlos, the grandson of the exiled King Alfonso III, as his official successor, expecting him to continue the authoritarian regime.
But he didn't.
No, when Franco died and King Juan Carlos VIII ascended to the throne, he did the exact opposite. He used the absolute power he inherited to dismantle the dictatorship from the inside out and steer the country toward a multi-party parliamentary democracy.
That is incredible, a monarch inheriting absolute power and voluntarily giving it up to the people. But it couldn't have been a smooth process, right? The military and the old fascist guard must have been furious.
It was a highly delicate, dangerous tightrope walk. You had terrorism from both the extreme left and right, including the violent Basque separatist group ETA. But the political elite managed to reach a consensus. In 1978, a new democratic constitution was drafted and approved by 88% of the voters in a national referendum.
And that constitution is what still governs Spain today.
Yes. However, the transition almost failed a few years later. On February 23, 1981, rebel elements of the military, led by a lieutenant colonel named Antonio Tejero, literally stormed the Spanish parliament.
Wait, they literally stormed the building?
They fired submachine guns into the ceiling and held the entire government hostage in an attempted coup d'etat.
Just a few years into democracy, and military officers are holding the parliament hostage. How did it not collapse?
It came down to the king. Juan Carlos, acting as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, put on his captain general uniform, went on national television in the middle of the night, and forcefully ordered the military back to their barracks.
He just told them to stop.
He essentially told them that any coup would have to be over his dead body. The rebel units stood down, the hostages were released, and the democracy survived.
It sounds like a Hollywood script, but it worked. The democracy held. And that brings us to the modern era. So you have a country that just saved its democracy from military coup, but you also have these fiercely proud, distinct regions, the Basque Country, Catalonia, Galicia, that were repressed for 40 years under Franco and are demanding autonomy. How on earth do you write a modern political structure that keeps all these regions from breaking apart?
The answer the framers of the 1978 Constitution came up with is known as the state of autonomies. Today, Spain is a secular parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy. King Felipe VI is the current head of state.
Let's clarify the king's role first. Does the monarch actually run the government? Can he veto laws or dictate policy?
Not at all. The role of the crown in Spain is very strictly defined. The Constitution makes it explicitly clear that the monarch does not make public policy or administer services. He is the symbol of the state's unity and permanence. He acts as a moderating branch.
The sources mention this concept of absolute inviolability in something called a referendo. Unpack that for us. If the king is inviolable, does that mean he is above the law?
Inviolability means the king cannot be held legally or politically responsible for his official acts. However, to prevent absolute power, the Constitution requires that every single official act the king performs must be countersigned, that is, the referendo, by the prime minister, a minister, or the president of the Congress.
Ah, so someone else takes the responsibility.
Yes. The elected official who signs the document is the one who assumes full political and legal responsibility for the act, not the king.
I see. So the actual power, the executive authority, rests with the elected government.
Yes. The executive branch is led by the prime minister, currently Pedro Sanchez, who answers to the Cortes Generales, the bicameral parliament consisting of the Congress of Deputies and the Senate.
Okay, so that handles the central government in Madrid. But what about the regions? How does the state of autonomies actually work?
Spain is one of the most highly decentralized countries in Europe. The Constitution recognized the right to self-government of the nationalities and regions of Spain. They divided the country into 17 autonomous communities and 2 autonomous cities.
17 of them.
Yes, and each of these communities has its own elected parliament, its own regional president, and manages massive budgets for crucial services like healthcare and education.
But I noticed a term in the notes, asymmetrical devolution. Does that mean that not all 17 regions have the exact same powers?
Exactly. This raises an important question. How do you manage different levels of regional identity? The architects of the Constitution knew that regions with deep historical identities and distinct languages, specifically Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia, which are officially recognized as nationalities, demanded a higher level of self-government than, say, a region like Madrid or Murcia.
Give me a concrete example of this asymmetry. What can the Basque Country do that other regions can't?
The most striking example is fiscal autonomy. The Basque Country and the neighboring region of Navarre operate under ancient historical tax laws known as foral provisions.
What does that actually mean for someone paying taxes?
It means the Basque regional government collects all of its own taxes directly from its citizens. They do not send their tax revenue to the central government in Madrid to be redistributed.
They just keep it.
Instead, they collect the money, fund their own services, and then pay an agreed-upon quota, the cupo, to Madrid to cover national services like defense and foreign affairs. Most other regions in Spain collect taxes that go to Madrid first and are then allocated back out.
That is a massive amount of regional power.
It is. Furthermore, several of these historical regions have their own fully autonomous police forces. The Basque Country has the Ertzaintza, Catalonia relies on the Mossos d'Esquadra, and Navarre has the Policia Foral.
So not just local sheriffs?
No, they handle serious criminal investigations, riot control, and counterterrorism within their territories, largely replacing the national police forces.
It sounds like a remarkably intricate balancing act. You're giving these regions just enough autonomy to govern themselves, but keeping them tied to the central state. But obviously that balance has been violently tested. We have to look at the facts regarding the 2017 constitutional crisis in Catalonia.
Yes, the Catalan independence movement has been the most significant challenge to the state of autonomies. To look strictly at the factual timeline provided in the sources. In October 2017, the Catalan regional government held an independence referendum, which the Spanish Constitutional Court had preemptively ruled illegal. The regional parliament then voted to unilaterally declare independence from Spain.
And how did the central government in Madrid respond? Did they just accept it?
Not at all. On the exact same day as the declaration, the Spanish Senate invoked Article 155 of the Constitution for the first time in history. This granted the Prime Minister the power to impose direct, centralized rule over Catalonia.
So they took over.
The Prime Minister dismissed the Catalan president, dissolved the regional parliament, and called for snap regional elections. Crucially, on the international stage, no foreign government or international body recognized Catalonia as a sovereign state.
It was a massive collision of regionalism and constitutional law. But looking at the objective notes, it seems the tension has cooled significantly in recent years. What does the current polling data tell us about how Catalans actually view their identity today?
The identity data is incredibly nuanced. According to recent polling, the idea that the entire region universally wants to break away is factually incorrect. Only 17.3% of the population identify as only Catalan.
That's less than 20%.
Right. The largest demographic bloc, at 46%, say they feel as Spanish as Catalan. Another 21.8% feel more Catalan than Spanish.
So the majority view themselves as possessing a dual identity.
Yes. And additional university polling from 2024 showed that if a legal referendum were held today, over 50% of Catalans would vote against independence, with less than 40% in favor. In fact, in the 2024 regional elections, the pro-independence parties lost their absolute majority for the first time in over a decade.
It perfectly illustrates how complex regional identity truly is. People can be fiercely proud of their local culture without necessarily wanting to sever ties with the broader state.
Absolutely.
So you have a political system that requires constant negotiation, regional friction, and intricate power sharing. You would think a government that complex would be sluggish or economically bogged down. But looking at the economic data in our sources, it's the exact opposite. As of 2024, Spain is the fastest growing major advanced economy in the world. How are they pulling that off?
Spain's economic transformation is staggering. They joined the European Economic Community, now the EU, in 1986, which forced rapid modernization. Today, their nominal GDP is nearly $1.9 trillion, making it the 12th largest economy globally and the 4th largest in the European Union. They are growing at a rate nearly 4 times higher than the Eurozone average.
I always hear about the tourism sector, but an economy of that scale can't just be built on hotels and beaches. What are the major engines driving this growth?
Since opening up, Spanish multinational companies have become global heavyweights, particularly in banking, telecommunications, and energy. Companies like Banco Santander, Telefonica, and Iberdrola, which is currently the world's largest renewable energy operator, have massive presences, especially in Latin America, where Spain is the second largest foreign investor.
And I was looking at the manufacturing data you highlighted, specifically the automotive sector. I think when most people think of European car manufacturing, they instantly think of Germany or Italy. But Spain's numbers are massive. Just how big is the auto industry there?
It is a pillar of the economy. The automotive sector accounts for roughly a tenth of Spain's entire GDP and employs about 9% of the national labor force. In 2023, Spain produced 2.45 million cars.
Wow.
Yeah, that makes them the second largest automaker in Europe, right behind Germany, and the 8th largest in the world.
Over 2 million cars. Are they all driving them domestically?
No, and that is the key metric. They export 89% of those vehicles. It is a massive industrial export hub.
And speaking of industry, I want to talk about infrastructure. Because if you are going to manufacture and move that much product or move 94 million tourists around a highly mountainous country, you need good transport. And the data on their rail system is jaw-dropping. Tell me about the AVE.
The AZE is Spain's high-speed rail network. As of early 2025, Spain operates almost 4,000 kilometers of high-speed track. To put that in perspective, that is the longest high-speed network in Europe and the second longest in the entire world, trailing only behind China.
If you are listening to this in the US or the UK, where building a few miles of new track can take decades, billions of dollars, and endless political fighting, just imagine this system. You have trains gliding effortlessly through massive mountain ranges at 330 kilometers per hour.
And it isn't just fast. It is incredibly efficient. The AVE system has an on-time arrival rate of 98.5%. It is the second most punctual train system on the planet, behind only Japan's Shinkansen. It connects major distant hubs like Madrid, Barcelona, Seville, and Valencia, effectively shrinking the country. You can live in a different region and commute to the capital in a matter of hours.
And powering all this infrastructure takes massive amounts of energy. We mentioned climate change earlier and how they are adapting. How advanced is their renewable sector?
Very advanced. Because they lack significant domestic oil or gas reserves, they leaned heavily into renewables early on. By 2010, they were already the world leader in solar power. Today, they are Europe's main producer of wind energy. The source text highlights a specific day recently where wind power alone covered 53% of mainland electricity demand.
Over half their electricity from wind alone.
Yes. That single grid generated the equivalent power of 14 nuclear reactors simultaneously.
Okay, so they have high-speed trains, massive solar farms, booming car exports, and the fastest-growing major economy. It sounds like a utopia, but there has to be a catch. What is the fundamental vulnerability in this economic model?
The vulnerability is deeply human. It is demographics. The data presents a stark, almost alarming reality. Spain's total fertility rate as of 2024 is just 1.90 children per woman.
Just 1.9.
That is far below the replacement level of 2.1, and it is the second lowest rate in the entire European Union.
So people simply aren't having kids. Why is that?
It's a combination of factors: job insecurity among the youth, the high cost of housing, and cultural shifts away from traditional family structures. Consequently, Spain has one of the oldest populations in the world, with a median age of 46.8 years. A rapidly shrinking, aging native workforce presents an existential challenge for sustaining economic growth and paying for a massive public pension and healthcare system.
How do you run an expanding, hyper-modern economy when a huge chunk of your population is retiring and there are no young people to replace them in the workforce? What is the government's solution?
The primary solution is large-scale immigration. The text outlines a profound demographic shift. As of 2026, Spain's population is roughly 49.5 million. But over 20% of that population, more than 10 million people, were born abroad. Spain ranks fourth in Europe for its immigrant population.
Where are these immigrants coming from?
The largest groups come from Morocco, Colombia, Venezuela, and Romania. The influx from Latin America is particularly strong due to deep shared cultural and linguistic ties, making integration much smoother.
And they enter the workforce.
Yes, these immigrants are vital for filling labor demands in agriculture, construction, and the service sector. The government has openly acknowledged this economic necessity. They are actively planning to legalize up to 900,000 undocumented migrants by 2027, specifically to sustain this economic momentum and keep the welfare state funded.
It is a complete demographic transformation. A country that historically sent millions of immigrants across the globe to the Americas is now one of the world's primary destinations for immigrants. And this diversity, this blending of the old and the new, leads perfectly into our final area of exploration: Spain as a global cultural superpower.
The term superpower is entirely appropriate here. Spain's cultural footprint on the world is vastly disproportionate to its geographic size or population.
We touched on tourism briefly, but let's look at the actual numbers. In 2024, they welcomed 94 million international tourists. The entire population of Spain is 49.5 million. They are taking in almost double their population in tourists every single year. They are the second most visited country on Earth. Why? What are all these people coming to see?
They are coming to experience an unparalleled density of history and culture. Spain boasts 50 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. You can walk through the intricate mathematical perfection of the Islamic stucco in the Alhambra in Granada. You can travel to Barcelona and stand inside the Sagrada Familia and Toni Gaudi's staggering, unfinished modernist cathedral that looks like a forest made of stone. You have medieval walled cities, pristine Mediterranean beaches, and world-class museums.
And the culture isn't just physical architecture, it's linguistic. The Spanish language itself is one of the most powerful tools of global soft power.
Absolutely. The Spanish language, which originated as a dialect in the central region of Castile, was globalized by the empire. Today, there are over 600 million Hispanophones worldwide. It is the world's second most spoken native language, right behind Mandarin Chinese. It dominates the Americas from the U.S. border down to Tierra del Fuego.
But internally, if you travel through Spain, it isn't just Spanish you hear on the streets, right? We talked about regionalism. What is the linguistic reality inside the country?
Internally, Spain is richly multilingual, and these languages are fiercely protected by the Constitution as core components of regional identity. Castilian Spanish is the first language for roughly 81.5% of the population, but Catalan, spoken in the Northeast and the Balearic Islands, is the first language for 10.5%. Galician, which is closely related to Portuguese, is spoken by nearly 3.8% in the Northwest, and then you have Basque, spoken by 1.4% in the North.
I've always heard Basque is a linguistic mystery.
It is. Basque, or Euskara, is a pre-Indo-European language isolate. It has absolutely no known linguistic relatives anywhere in the world. It predates the Romans, the Celts, everyone. The fact that it survived thousands of years of imperial conquest is a testament to the isolation of those northern mountains we discussed earlier.
That diversity extends directly into their artistic output. Spain has produced cultural heavyweights that have defined entire eras of human creativity. During the Golden Age, you have Diego Velázquez painting Las Meninas, playing with perspective and reality in a way no one had before. You have Francisco Goya transitioning from court painter to capturing the horrific, gritty reality of the Peninsular War. And then the 20th century, well, the 20th century is huge.
In the 20th century, Spanish artists essentially defined global modernism. Pablo Picasso revolutionized how we see form with Cubism. Salvador Dali mapped the subconscious with Surrealism. Jean Miro blended abstraction with Catalan folk art. And in literature, Miguel de Cervantes wrote Don Quixote in the early 1600s, which is widely considered the first true modern novel, establishing narrative techniques that authors still use today.
Let's talk about an art form you can actually eat. Spanish cuisine has completely conquered global palates, from high-end Michelin-starred molecular gastronomy to neighborhood tapas bars. But the source notes brilliantly point out that Spanish food isn't a single monolith. It is entirely dictated by the geography.
Exactly. The culinary map perfectly overlaps with the climate map we discussed in the beginning. The cuisine is divided into three main zones. First, Mediterranean Spain along the coast. Here, the diet is heavily based on seafood, olive oil, and rice.
So Zone 1 is the coast.
Yeah, this is where you find authentic Valencian paella and cold, refreshing vegetable soups like gazpacho, designed for the scorching summers.
Which makes sense for the heat. And the second zone.
Inner Spain, the Central Plateau. This region experiences freezing winters, so the food is hearty and substantial. You have thick garlic soups, massive meat and chickpea stews like cocido madrileño, and world-renowned cured meats like jamón ibérico, which comes from free-range pigs fed on acorns.
And finally, the rainy green north.
Atlantic Spain, places like Galicia and the Basque Country. This region is famous for its exceptional seafood, rich fish stews, cod dishes, and iconic regional plates like Galician octopus, polvo a fera, heavily dusted with paprika. The Basque city of San Sebastian actually holds one of the highest concentrations of Michelin stars per capita in the world.
All right, we cannot finish a deep dive into Spain's global influence without talking about the ultimate projection of soft power sports. How does a country of 49 million people so thoroughly dominate the global sporting landscape?
It is a relatively modern phenomenon, heavily catalyzed by Spain hosting the 1992 Olympic Games in Barcelona, which completely modernized their sporting infrastructure. Today, football is essentially a religion. Clubs like Real Madrid and FC Barcelona are massive global brands with hundreds of millions of followers worldwide.
And the national teams.
Unprecedented success. The Spanish men's national team achieved something no other European nation has done, winning 3 back-to-back major international tournaments. They won the European Championship in 2008, the World Cup in 2010, and the Euros again in 2012, playing a revolutionary style of possession football called tiki-taka. And they just recently won the Euros again in 2024. Furthermore, the women's national team just won the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup.
And it isn't just football. Look at tennis. You have Rafael Nadal, arguably the greatest clay court player in history, and now Carlos Alcaraz dominating the next generation. It is just an endless pipeline of elite talent.
It is the ultimate synthesis of national infrastructure and cultural passion. Whether it is through an Alcaraz forehand, a Picasso painting, or the Spanish language itself, Spain projects an image of vitality and excellence that resonates in every corner of the globe.
So if we take a step back and look at the entire journey we've been on today, we started with prehistoric humans painting caves and ancient Phoenicians naming a land of rabbits. We traced the rise and fall of Rome, the golden age of Islamic Al-Andalus, the relentless Reconquista, and the explosion of a global maritime empire that conquered continents but bankrupted itself. We navigated the sheer chaos of the 19th century, the trauma of the Civil War, the isolation of a 36-year dictatorship, and finally the miraculous transition into a modern, highly decentralized, renewable energy-powered democracy with the fastest-growing economy in the advanced world. It is an encyclopedic, breathtaking story of a nation that simply refuses to be just one thing.
It truly is. And as we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Spain is a country fundamentally built on the blending of seemingly impossible contradictions. It marries the rigid legalism of Rome with the architectural grace of Islam. It balances a centralized historic monarchy with fierce, constitutionally protected regional autonomy. It juxtaposes ancient, rural village traditions with hyper-modern bullet trains and vast fields of solar panels. As nations all around the world currently grapple with their own massive crises, political polarization, the urgent need for climate adaptation, and the looming threat of demographic collapse. Perhaps Spain's 3,000-year history of constant resilient reinvention, it isn't just a fascinating story of the past. Perhaps it is the ultimate survival blueprint for the 21st century. What could your own community or your own country learn from the Spanish model of embracing such intense complexity?
That is a brilliant question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this massive deep dive into the mechanics and the soul of Spain. It has been a wild ride, but I hope you leave this conversation feeling a little more connected to the incredible mosaic that makes up this nation. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we will see you on the next deep dive.